here, and I'm really looking forward to having you speak for us.
Well, Angie, thank you very much. I have never been introduced in relation to Justin Bieber, I can assure you, but I did just have to procure tickets for my nieces to come see Justin Bieber next month, and all my friends were convinced that I was actually secretly going to be going with them, but I was told it was just them. It's an honor to be here, and so I have two apologies. One, I picked the wrong color blue this morning. I was between this and navy, and I didn't have royal, so I apologize, but I also want to let the Reverend know this is not a nod to UNC, having grown up in Maryland, so I apologize to you as well. But it's really an honor to be here, and I have to tell you, the last hour and a half was really special for me, and I'm actually exhausted listening to the inspiring stories, and God help the members of Congress on Wednesday, because if you share those stories with half as much emotion, you will be entirely successful, and there's nothing on this sheet, whether it be an increase to the always historically underfunded CDC, or whether it be an increase to NIH and NCI, or whether it be the screening provisions in the ACA. All of those things need to happen, and Wednesday will just be the beginning of the road to your success. So thanks for allowing me to sit in and share. I also want to just say that as I was listening, I started to hear stories and remember stories of so many friends of mine. One of them being a good friend of mine named David Leibovitz, who I was introduced to about 8 years ago. He was the assistant district attorney in Austin, Texas, and he was in his early 30s, and a friend of mine sent me an email and said, hey, I think you should meet this guy David, and I had no idea why. We got together for coffee, and he explained over coffee that he had been diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And David passed away about a year and a half later, having been enrolled in several clinical trials and having struggled mightily, and left behind a beautiful wife and two young sons. And I think about David all the time because he was so bright and so full of poise and passion, and most likely, if you were alive today, would be the mayor of Austin or a senator or a congressman that you might be meeting with on Wednesday. And as I was listening, I was thinking about David. I was thinking about a good friend of mine from college, Rachel Perline, who passed away last fall. I was thinking about another friend of mine from college who called me a couple years ago and left a voicemail, and I'll never forget where I was. I was coming out of a Mexican restaurant in Austin. I looked down at my phone, and it said voicemail from Scott Powers. And having done this work for such a long time, when you get a voicemail from someone that you haven't talked to in a long time, you immediately know why they're calling. They're calling because someone in their family or someone close to them was diagnosed. And I didn't even have to listen to the voicemail. And I called Scott back, and he explained to me that his wife at age 31 was diagnosed with stage 3 colorectal cancer. And so I want to thank you for sharing your story, but also thank you for allowing me to listen and reflect back on the people that I know and love who some are with us and some are not, and they are all, and their families are all grateful for the work that you're doing here and beyond. So I thought what I'd do is just talk for a few minutes about something that I believe to be really true at its core, and it's something that maybe Trish can relate to, because I had the privilege of growing up in Columbia, Maryland, where Trish mentions she lives and works. And one of the things that I learned when I was a kid growing up there is my parents used to tell me all the time that anything is possible. And I think when I was a kid, I used to ignore them, and I used to sort of let it go in one ear and out the other, as most kids do. And it wasn't until later in life that I realized that that truly is so meaningful and so accurate. And so I stand here today to just emphasize to you that, having listened to the personal passion in this room, anything is possible. Anything. Whether it's what you're going to do on Wednesday on the Hill, or what you're going to do on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, next week, and next month, anything is possible because of this collective voice. And I do believe that we are truly faster together. So let me tell you briefly a little bit about my journey. But I grew up in this idyllic community with wonderful parents, wonderful brother, nothing ever having been wrong medically until I was about 19. and I was out running one night, and I ended up having some kind of asthmatic reaction, and I ended up going to the emergency room. And as I left the emergency room, the physician on call said, "You're totally fine. It's a hot, humid August East Coast night. It's probably just some pollen or something in the air. But just before you leave, let's do a chest x-ray." I'd never been to the hospital before, never been sick, never had any interaction with the medical system. And as I was leaving that night after having had the x-ray, he said, "You're totally fine." I woke up the next morning and I was asymptomatic. I went to work that day. I was coaching soccer at a youth soccer camp. And when I got home that afternoon, there was and this will date the story, this is 1996, there was a message on the answering machine. This was back when answering machine messages were fun and exciting, and the light was blinking, and you were like, "Yes, I got a message." Now it's like, "Oh no, I've got so many messages." But the message was from our family physician. And he said, "I was in the hospital earlier today, and they notified me that you were here last night. So I looked at your x-ray. You need to have a CAT scan immediately." And so I went that afternoon and had a CAT scan, and lo and behold, it discovered a very rare tumor growing in my rib cage behind my heart. And while it wasn't colon cancer, it was a very rare type of cancer called chondrosarcoma. It changed my life forever. And one of the most exciting things about the last hour and a half for me was seeing so many young adults and hearing so many young adults share their story. Because at 19, I remember, just as you heard earlier, being in this no man's land. I remember calling other cancer organizations and people saying, "Well, we don't really offer services because people your age don't get cancer." Things like that were literally said to my parents and I on the phone, and it never sat well with us. And I too, to the comment earlier, learned advocacy from my parents way before my cancer diagnosis. And I will tell you, when I checked into the hospital for the first time, I'll never forget this sort of quasi-argument I had with my mom, because she said, "I'm going to spend the night with you." And I said, "Mom, you don't need to spend the night. I'm 19. What are you talking about?" And she said, "Trust me." She said, "If your dad was in the hospital, if it was anybody else, I'm spending the night with you." And I learned personal advocacy. I learned that when you're diagnosed and when you're feeling vulnerable and when you're dealing with the roller coaster of emotions that everyone in this room has dealt with, you need somebody there by your side. And I'm grateful that she had the energy and the passion to stand up and do what was right. She was also, about a day or two later, told by some of the medical professionals, "You should really go home and get some rest." And I can tell you that that didn't sit very well. I've never seen my parents that angry, to be honest, as they were that day. They said, "Look, we're not going anywhere, so you can get used to us asking questions and advocating on behalf of our son." I came across this quote not too long after that, and I thought it was really prophetic, and the reason that we're all here. You heard the word obligation several times as people shared their stories, but we do have an obligation. Whether we were diagnosed ourselves or whether it was a family member or loved one, we're all here with the obligation to stand up and to act on behalf of those whose voices cannot be heard. And I thought that that was really suiting and suited for what I've been able to be a part of. And I stand here humbly and just to tell you that it's been an honor to participate in a community, the cancer community, that is so vibrant and so motivated and so impatient and so desirous of transformational results. I don't think anybody in this room is here because we want to make incremental progress. People want to solve this problem, and they want to solve this problem for those of us in this room who are counting on it, and for those in the next generation and those who will be diagnosed, unfortunately, in the future. And one of the things I learned over time was that you can advocate in many different ways. You can be a personal advocate. You can be a political advocate. You can share your story just as everybody has done earlier today. And one of the things I learned during my time at Livestrong was, in addition to this idea that anything is possible, it was that we had to create more and more opportunities for people to have a platform to be involved. See, I'm a big believer that it's human nature to want to give back. It's human nature to want to be a part of something bigger than any one of us. And it's human nature to want to make a difference in the world. And unfortunately, I feel like so few people ever get that chance. And you heard some mention that cancer was a blessing, and others talk about the good things that have come as a result. And I wouldn't wish this disease on anyone, but it's given everybody in this room a focus and a passion and a way to direct our energy towards something bigger than any one of us. And this little yellow wristband that came out 12 years ago, yes, it helped build a brand, and yes, it helped raise a lot of money, but what it did that was way more important than that was it started a massive conversation. I remember walking up to people all across the country and asking them, why do you have that on? I'll never forget, I was in Whole Foods once in Denver, Colorado, and there was a 16 or 17-year-old young woman working at the register, and I asked her why she had this yellow wristband on. She actually had a yellow wristband and a pink wristband. And she looked at me, and she, at the most, was 17, and she said, the pink one I wear for my mom, and the yellow one I wear for everyone else with cancer. And I thought, if we do nothing else but allow people to be proud to be associated with a community who cares, a community who understands, and a community who wants to make a difference, then we've done something really special. The other thing that it did was it created this grassroots movement. It created people who said, enough is enough. I want to put an end to the suffering that cancer survivors deal with every day. You heard earlier people talk about the long-term and late effects and survivorship issues, and these are real issues. And I want to share two stories with you that hopefully highlight why being here in Washington, D.C. is so important. The first is a story to highlight that you have to share your story over and over and over and over again. And I know on Wednesday, because I've been here on these Hill days before, I know it gets exhausting. You're taking a bus, then you're walking from room to room, then you're going outside, then you're going to another meeting, then you're meeting with a staffer, then you're meeting with a member. It's tiring. But you have to share that story with the same level of care and passion and emotion every single time, whether it's 4 in the afternoon or 8 in the morning. A couple of years ago, I was on the Hill, and I was meeting with a staff member for a U.S. Senator, and we were talking about a bill that was before Congress at the time, and it was a survivorship bill looking at the long-term and late effects of the disease. And this young, bright, energetic staff person, after I had told my story and after I had shared why I thought this bill was so important, looked at me with a straight face and said, so when you talk about survivorship, are you saying that we should be funding massage therapy? And I was so angry. I was so frustrated. And it took everything inside of me not to just sort of spend the rest of the afternoon yelling and screaming. But it showed me that this is a long road. This isn't going to happen right away. It's not going to happen the first time you walk in and share your story. It's not going to happen the second time or the third time. This is going to take a lot of education. And we have to have sort of the patience, but also the sense of urgency. And so I did sit there for another 15 minutes and explain to this person that things like neuropathy, that things like chemo brain, that other long-term and late effects were real and were debilitating and were impacting the lives of millions of people across the country. And I'd like to think that at the end of that session, he understood a little bit more about the term survivorship. The other story I want to share is something that took place in Texas a few years later, which was we had the opportunity to advocate for a piece of legislation that would create a $3 billion cancer research fund in the state of Texas. $300 million a year for 10 years. And it was a long process. It had to be approved by both houses. It had to be signed by the governor at the time. It had to be approved by the voters after that. And we got word a few weeks before the deadline to approve bills in the legislature in Texas. For those of you who don't know, in Texas, the legislature meets every other year, which is not that convenient when you're trying to advocate on behalf of something like cancer. And we got word that one of the main members, the speaker at the time, who had full control over what gets voted on and what doesn't, Texas does things a little bit differently sometimes, was not in favor of bringing this up for a vote. We knew we had the votes, we knew it would pass if he brought it up, and the result would be $300 million a year for 10 years. And so we activated this advocacy movement. And we sent an email out to about 300,000 people in Texas, and we said, please call and please email right away. And within 45 minutes, the speaker's office called and said, please tell your people to stop. And the result of that is $300 million a year being invested in cancer research and prevention in the state of Texas. So I don't share that to brag in any way other than to say advocacy can work. And every time you share your story and every person you encourage to share theirs can have a huge impact. I have the privilege now of working at an organization called Pelotonia, and one of the things that we're most proud of is that we've invested millions of dollars over the last 3 years in research looking at Lynch syndrome and screening programs across the state of Ohio, especially in Appalachia and other underserved communities, to really identify who has this gene. And it's an honor to have heard so many people talk about Lynch today, and I can't wait to get back to my colleagues. Some of you may know Heather Hampel, who's a geneticist at the James, and in fact who's doing my genetic testing as we speak. But to hear in the voices of those who shared about Lynch was really inspiring. And for us, we're trying to create what started as an event in Columbus, Ohio, into an advocacy movement. And while it's seen now as an event and a fundraising experience, I think you'll see in the coming years that we'll be right by your side, and we'll be sending advocates here to call on Congress and other events to share their passion and to fight alongside you. You know, one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that anything's possible. And I think when you have a true community of people that are aligned and that are focused on a singular goal, that can be the case. This is a picture that was taken about 18 months ago on the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro. And I had the honor of traveling to Tanzania with a group of cancer survivors and advocates that I had never met before. And when we got to Tanzania and we sat at the base of the mountain, the guide that we brought with us from Colorado, who's a world-renowned mountain climber and coach and leadership expert, sat us down as a group. There were 16 of us, and he said, "You have a choice to make." And we looked around and we thought, what does he mean? We just flew around the world. What's the choice? And he said, "You have a choice. You can go to the top of the summit as one group, or we can divide the group into two, and we can have a faster group and a slower group." So there's 16 of us sitting around this table in Tanzania, mortified, nervous, anxious, not knowing one another. We had a 22-year-old and we had a 62-year-old, and we had everybody in between. And we looked around at each other, and there was some sizing of people, you know, like, oh, I don't know, can that person make it? Should we go fast? Should we go slow? I didn't come all the way over here not to make it. You know, all that was going through everybody's minds. And after about 40 minutes, Chris, the guide, came back and he said, "What did you guys decide?" And we said, "We're going to go together." And he said, "Great." He said, "Let me give you some new information now." He said, did everybody bring all of the gear that I recommended you bring? People said yes. He said, "Did everybody bring the snacks and the food and the hydration tablets and everything else that I told you about?" And people said yes. And he said, "It no longer belongs to you. It now belongs to the team." And the reason I put this picture up here is because 16 people who didn't know each other, who committed to do something together, who all had a shared purpose and a common vision and a common goal, made it to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro as one group. Not because we are all great athletes, not because we had any climbing experience, not because we knew anything about what we were about to embark on. I can tell you, for me, sleeping in a tent for 7 days in the freezing cold, as my wife would tell you, is not something that she ever thought would be possible. But it was because of that singular purpose and singular vision and singular focus that we were able to do that. And I share that because everyone in this room shares the same purpose and the same vision and the same focus. And when we rally as one community that realizes that embracing each other and hugging each other and crying together and advocating together and standing up together and sharing our story together, there's nothing that isn't possible. So I hope that you will go on Wednesday with the same emotion and the same passion, and also the realization that this is not going to be the end of our work. It actually is just the next milestone and the beginning. And so the three things I want to leave you with that are most important in my mind when you go to share your story. One is be really, 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 really personal, just like you were here. I mean, I feel like I'm in a room with family, and I'm exhausted, and I haven't cried this much in a long, long time, and I loved every minute of it. So be personal. The second is be direct. Ask for everything on this sheet. Demand that we have to be accountable. It's not acceptable that people don't get access to screening. It's not acceptable that more research isn't funded in NIH. It's not acceptable that for 3 or 4 decades the CDC has been habitually underfunded. None of that is acceptable. So be direct and make the ask. And lastly, to the example I gave earlier, don't assume that they know anything. Just don't assume. It's a revolving door. They're hearing from every advocacy group on every topic imaginable. don't assume meeting after meeting that they know why you're there. So share with emotion, be direct, and don't assume that they understand as well as you do the cause that we all care about so very much. So I want to just thank you for the opportunity to be here. And again, I want to just honor my friend David and my friend Rachel and my friend Erica, because you allowed me today to think about them in a way that I haven't in a very long time. And it's been a true privilege to be with you. Thank you on behalf of myself. Thank you on behalf of both my parents who are cancer survivors, and most especially on behalf of my 2-year-old Sam and my 4-year-old Clara, who I hope will grow up in a world where they don't have to fear and worry about this disease the way many of us have. Thank you so very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Doug. That was amazing. Doug actually does need to catch a plane fairly soon, but we do have time for a couple of questions before he makes his clean getaway. So anyone, specific questions? We have microphones. We can circulate the mic. Elaine, are you coming to the... Oh, no. All right. I won't name you out anymore. Live stream. Okay, perfect. Emily?
Sorry, I have to filter them first. Okay, this is exciting. Is this one on? Yes. I'm so sorry. It's from our founder, and so I automatically assumed it was a great question, and it asked if our live stream was running. So, yeah.
Tell her happy birthday.
The other question, and you may want to take a general perspective on this, it gets a little bit specific, but should scientists start working on better adjuvant therapies to replace some of the toxic protocols that now produce considerable long-term effects? And that is from Jacques.
Yeah, so the great question. I think in general, whether it be colon cancer or any other type of the disease, there's been tremendous progress made, and I think we'll look back, in years and think, wow, how archaic the current therapy is and the way that we treat people with this disease. So I think it sort of comes full circle. I mean, the good news is that people are surviving long enough to understand the needs that they have, and our hope is that that will translate into new research and new clinical trials that look at how can we reduce the toxicity and reduce the number of long-term and late effects that come as a result of the current therapy. So, I think, again, when our kids grow up and we tell them that we were treated with chemotherapy and radiation, I think they're going to laugh and they're going to say, you got to be kidding me. In 2016, that's the best we have for these diseases that have been plaguing our society for way too long. So my hope is that the survivorship research, as we learn more and more about the long-term and late effects, that will drive innovation on the front end and on the translational research side. Yeah.
After Call on Congress, and there are always these random fundraisers, and you ask and ask and ask, but what do we do? Like, what do you recommend from a survivor at home if this is not going to be our career? Like, you've made this into who you are. I'm a 5th grade teacher. What do we do other than ask for money, other than share our story? What's something else that we can make that collective unit of people fighting together?
It's a good question. First of all, I think sharing your story is more important than any of us might realize. The reason being is none of us will ever know the true impact. I mean, sharing your story this week, sharing your story tomorrow and Wednesday, somebody will go get screened. Somebody will take an action, and the beauty of it is that you'll probably never know that person's name, you'll never get to meet that person, but you'll forever have changed their life. And so as draining as it can be to share the story over and over again, and to think that you've reached everybody in your community or you've sort of impacted as many people as you can, we can never really do that, in my opinion. And so whether that's teaching young kids about preventive measures and how they can best support somebody who's dealing with this disease. I'll never forget, we had a curriculum for elementary school kids years ago, and one of the first lessons was that cancer is not contagious. And it was amazing how many first and second graders learned that they could go over to Bobby or Johnny's house, even though Bobby's mom or dad had cancer, and that it was okay. And so I think sometimes as research advocates and lobby day advocates, we're sort of up at such a high level, sometimes we forget that there are other things that we can do that are simple in nature, but that could have a huge impact. And I would say the same thing on the fundraising side. I mean, it's interesting. The number one reason why people don't give money is they're never asked. And a lot of times we hear through Pelotonia and Livestrong, we heard from people who said, yeah, but I don't want to ask those people year after year after year. And the reality is that people are offended if you don't ask, especially when they know your story, especially when they know that you're spending your time and energy doing something here. People want to invest in people who are passionate and committed. And so as hard as it is to fundraise year after year, I find that people expect it and they want to be a part of something special. So the more we can communicate the impact of what you're doing here this week, the more they're going to want to invest. And the other thing I'd say about fundraising is I've learned that someone's capacity to give is absolutely zero indication of what they will give. And you'll have people who will surprise you and make investments in this cause that you didn't think they could afford, and you'll have people who you think, oh, they could afford millions and millions of dollars, and they'll give you 10. And so, we don't judge, and people have their own passions, their own stories, and some people want to do things in very personal ways. So I think doing those two things is really important, and just never forgetting that you can have an impact on people's lives even though you may never meet them.
I probably don't need a microphone. You know, the live stream. We've all done a really. Is it on? Okay. We've all done a really good job of working together, and obviously, look how much Call in Congress has grown. So, do you have any suggestions for us? Because obviously, you've probably had to partner and work with other organizations or other groups or other people. And as you can tell, we have, Colon Club, we have Young Adult Survivors, we have people who want to do stuff at home, we have Fight CRC, other organizations we work with. What advice can you give us on how to continue to do that 1 million strong and do it even stronger? So we're not all competing against, not that we're competing, I don't mean it like that, but that we're all kind of working together at our own homes, making the same ask, being universal, kind of like, I don't want to bring up the pink, but kind of like the pink.
Yeah.
So we want people to look at this blue star and know what it means.
Yeah.
And so how can we be more cohesive?
Well, good question. No, look, it's hard. I think it's easier today than it's ever been, and partly because of social media, whereby we can all connect in ways that we couldn't, and we can share information. And I always say social media is an unbelievable tool because it allows you to communicate transparently in real time with people who have sort of opted in. So if I follow you, or if I am on your page, I've chosen to hear the message that you're espousing, and it's also free. And it's easy. And so I think that's one way that we can all stay connected. I think the unfortunate reality is that there's been too much competition. And there's been too much competition for fundraising. There's been too much competition for taking credit for things. And the reality is, when everybody shared their story, I didn't get the sense from anybody in this room that anybody cares who gets the credit. Right? We want results. And so I think if we can always pull ourselves out of any of that sort of competitive environment and just remember why we're here, I think you can set the standard. And there's no reason why this couldn't be as big or as well known or as pervasive as any other symbol in the history of healthcare advocacy. And again, judging by the passion in the room, I can assure you that's the case. But I love the fact that there are partnerships in this room. And I love the fact that somebody mentioned they have their own nonprofit, and somebody else mentioned that they volunteered at their local hospital. I mean, that's great. We need more of that. It's not about, I only do this for CRC, or I only do this for Pelotonia, or I only do, those are the old days in my opinion. And so the other thing I'll say is, and again, I've had the privilege of going to a lot of events like this. I mean, I've never cried as much as I cried here. And again, I don't know what that says, but to me, it says that the emotion and the passion and the urgency of the people here can make anything happen. And I think if people over-communicate and overshare and are willing to partner, the sky's the limit. I mean, anything's possible.
And I appreciate you noticing that there is a lot of partnerships here, and that that loyalty and that coming together and wanting to be a united force. So that kind of answers my question a little bit of just knowing that you saw that.
Absolutely.
And that we're actually exuding that and people are seeing it. And the other thing is, we won't be impressed until you go home and you talk poop at the dinner table.
Happy to do that. My almost 5-year-old will be excited, I'm sure. But I'm so dehydrated from crying so much. I have a feeling I'm going to get on the airplane and I'm going to like pass out or something. But I can't say it more firmly. I'm really honored and humbled to have the opportunity to be here, because believe me, our dinner table will be talking about what I heard today, and I feel a sense of confidence knowing that you guys are here and knowing that you've dedicated your time and your talent to make a difference. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, so I heard the word urgency, and I think that actually resonated with several of you who need to use the restroom right now. So why don't we go ahead and take about a 10-minute break. We'll get back here at 3:10. And so if you can find an accountability partner who will make sure you're here, and then if that person is not seated by 3:10, you will be responsible for finding them. Find your accountable buddy, and go. 3:10, we'll be right back. Okay. And again, thank you, Doug, so much for everything.